Good evening and welcome to the second in our series of Maritime Heritage Trust talks, this time on the benefits and challenges of living on a historic vessel. And we welcome Scott Pereira, Secretary of the Maritime Heritage Trust and previously Chairman of the Residential Boat Owners Association.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk a bit about the artifacts, that is, the tangible heritage, so-called, which means the boats themselves, and where they come from, what they are, when they first started being lived on. And then I'll carry on with the sort of intangible stuff, which is, why people live on boats, how they live on boats, and who lives on boats. And then I'll try and put my own perspective using examples of my own boats, because it's much easier to get a first-hand impression of what it's all about. So I'll start off really with the history. And there is a long history. Boats have been lived on by the Brits particularly for many, many years. But it probably goes back several centuries anyway. So my next slide is just going through the sort of history. We think they probably first started living on boats, people independently of the land, that is, in South India. And in South India, they have these boats, which are still there. I mean, I've been on one and stayed there. They are very comfortable, but they have waterways which mean that these people don't have anywhere to live on land. And the British, of course, were involved in Kerala. They were also involved in Aberdeen harbour in Hong Kong, where they noticed that there was a tribe of fishermen who, again, lived on boats but didn't go ashore. So they were actually permanent liveaboards. And that was a little bit different from what the English were used to, because, of course, they were used to living on boats while they were traveling to and fro. But to actually stay on the boat long term was a little bit radical. But they got this idea from almost certainly that ethnic tribe. In the UK, people started living on barges quite early on, and the classic ones were the redundant London Livery Company barges, which had been used in the Lord Mayor's Show. They used to have the Lord Mayor's Show as a river parade, and when that stopped, the barges became redundant. They were rowing barges, of course, and they were towed up to Oxford and used as Oxford College barges, most of them, and many of them are still around. And they are not lived in particularly by anyone other than a boatman, but they are accommodations, as it were. And very similar ones were constructed as Thames houseboats, which in fact were towed to Henley for the rowing regatta. And they were not mobile on their own, but they had to be towed to and fro. But there were lots of those up and down the Thames. And very similar ones were built by the British Empire. So the British in North India wanted to go up into the mountains for the summer, to get away from the summer heat, as indeed the locals used to do. And they discovered that the favorite place, which was a lake in Kashmir, wasn't available to live on the land. The local Maharaja wouldn't allow them to live there. So they built boats and lived on those. I'll be showing pictures of all this later. So this is just a run through verbally through the history to give an idea of the sort of scale of time. The British tradition of living on a barge probably started with a chap called Ionides, who wrote a book before the First World War about living on a barge he'd converted. And the sailing barge was, sorry, Hilary? Right. The sailing, sorry about that little glitch here with background noise. He built this conversion, and the book he wrote is actually very similar to lots of books that have been written since. Basically, it has a description of the old boat, the way he converted it, lots of pictures, a plan of the boat, and some of the interesting aspects of living on a boat. He worked in the city, commuted in with his, he was wearing his suit, found this little creek that he lived in, which he was careful not to describe and give details of, because didn't want anyone else to move in. He brought his family up there, and they all swam in the river and that kind of thing. So it's a very classical early idea of how you convert a barge to live on, and that, of course, is something that lots of people do now. Abroad, in Seattle, the timber workers who used to bring rafts of timber down the rivers to export, used these rafts to live on, and they built these houses which are still there, very fine sort of Edwardian style barges, which are mostly there still. They tend to put more extra bits of wood underneath every few years as they gradually sink because they become waterlogged, but they are still there, and after many, many years, it's a traditional way of living in the United States and the West Coast, including, well, many parts of the US. They actually have boats very similar to these houseboats as we would think of them in the UK. Many children will have read Swallows and Amazons and the other Ransom books about children playing on boats. And Arthur Ransom, of course, includes a houseboat. It's in several of the books. Captain Flint, an ex-naval chap, has this boat that he lives on in the lakes, and it's described and drawn, and there's quite a lot of interesting stuff about it in the 1930s. After the war, Rolt wrote a book called Narrowboat, and then it was a boat called Cressy he lived on, and he wrote about traveling around the canals, and this really started the inland waterways movement in the UK, the restoration of the boats, and it was very popular for people who lived on narrowboats. That's the classic original book about it. And at the same time, or just after the war, they were selling off the Admiralty boats, which were excess requirements for the Navy. And because of the dereliction of London, particularly after the Blitz, there was very little housing available. So they suggested that people live on these boats, and this was government policy. They actually sold them off to be lived on. And indeed, this was quite a cultural thing just after the Second World War. So people have lived on boats in the UK for quite a long time, and I'll just show a few pictures of the sort of thing. And going back, these are houseboats in South India, in Kerala, on the left, and on the right, these houseboats that they live on in the Amazon. As you can imagine, an area that floods every year, regularly, of course, in the Amazon, it makes sense to have a boat to live on that actually floats away if necessary, but at least you don't get too wet. And this tradition, of course, is used in many communities who live in waterlogged areas. And these are the Tenka tribe. These are fishermen as a tribe who moved down to Hong Kong and lived in this harbour on their boats, working on the boats, obviously, but also living full time on them. These are the houseboats on Lake Dal. They're still there. There's a picture I'll show you in a minute, but this is the story that British Raj weren't allowed to build on land. The Maharaja wouldn't let them, so they built barges instead. And as you see, these are very similar. Well, as you'll see later, these are very similar to the Oxford College barges, the old livery barges that people used to row up and down on. And here's a recent thing, in fact, in the paper a few days ago, about the same problems that we have in the UK, really. They're living on a freshwater lake. There's pollution, the boats are sinking, they're getting old, of course. But they are very fine boats, not mobile mostly, except for going to and fro for maintenance, but they are definitely fairly swish, lavishly built by the Raj, of course. And this is the kind of interiors which are still like this. I mean, these are places that you can rent, and I know people who stayed there. Kashmir, of course, is a difficult place to live in now, but nevertheless, people have used them as tourists, and they do exist. But many of them, of course, are becoming derelict for the same reasons that similar boats are becoming derelict in the UK, because they're basically falling to bits and are being suspected of polluting the waterway. This is this early sailing barge conversion that I mentioned. This chap Ionides wrote this book. These are some of the illustrations from it. They're rather difficult to reproduce, but fine book. So you see that the original working boat, he showed a picture of it, and then he called it the Ark Royal. I don't know what its working name was, but that's what it was. And inside is this Edwardian interior, which of course is absolutely classical. Edwardian living. People would recognize this as a sort of turn of the last century accommodation. One of the things that all bargees, all people who live on boats which have been sailing barges will know, is that they have this massive keelson down the middle of the boat, which is very difficult to deal with. He carefully covers it in varnished mahogany to make a feature of it, but it can be quite a problem. As most boats like this, they will have problems about their accommodation. But of course, because they were designed as working boats with large empty holds, you could do pretty much what you wanted inside them. And the working boat cabin was separate, but the accommodation was usually in the hold. And here is Captain Flint's houseboat. The picture, the drawing, is the one that's in the books. It's hard to decide exactly which of the original boats was the pattern for it. Esperance and Gondola are both very old boats, both of which have been restored, having been houseboats for many years. Some of them sank, and there were lots of problems, but they did survive long term, really because they've been lived on for so long. And they're now Gondola on Coniston, Esperance on Windermere. They are being used, and there's been some problems with restoration, but they are active, and they really survived because they've been lived on. Otherwise, they probably would have been scrapped years ago. This is the sort of thing that the Navy were trying to persuade people to live on after the war. Motor torpedo boats. Cubit's Yacht Basin, just downriver from where we live in Richmond. Chiswick. It was quite a large basin. It's built over now, but most of it. But it was full of these old ex-Navy boats, and they survived really because they were lived on there. And you can see one of them, Motor Torpedo Boat 102, which is a famous a restoration of a gunboat which was used during the war, and it allowed people to restore them, having kept them pretty much intact without changing very much inside. But later in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, people decided that perhaps living on boats wasn't such a good idea. People were still living on boats, but they were finding it difficult. The security of tenure, freedom from harassment was becoming an issue. And our local MP, Toby Jessel, actually tried to get a private members bill through at one stage and was given a pretty robust no by government. And it never got very far, but it was quite useful legislation, very similar to what caravans and other mobile homes have. But boats have always avoided having any of this sort of legislation protection. More recently, as you can see, Grant Shapps, who's still around, of course, in his incarnation as a housing minister, said that actually it might be quite a good idea for people to live on boats, and it allowed for flexibility in moving around, and people could live safely and effectively in these situations. So that was sort of looking a little bit like government policy encouraging it again. And the problem in some ways is to decide what a houseboat really is, because the definitions are complex. I won't go through this in detail because it's incredibly Byzantinely complicated. The definitions are quite important for all sorts of legal reasons, but nobody can quite decide exactly what a houseboat is. Most of us that live on boats that move, think of them as residential boats, boats that can actually move just like an ordinary boat would be expected to. But of course, they can be much less mobile and can be designed to stay in one place and never move and be plumbed into the mains and generally immobile. But most of us feel that that's really not the proper boat. And old boats, which have been restored on the whole, they've been maintained as their original appearance, particularly, will tend to be mobile or have been mobile. So what sort of boats do people live on? Well, there are some which are designed for living aboard. They're things like narrowboats, which have back cabins. They're tiny, but you can live in them. We have. And the hold of a narrowboat is 72 feet long. It's like living on a corridor if you convert the hold. But the back cabin was designed for families of up to 4 or 5 people, including several children. And they are small but perfectly formed, very cleverly made. And people have successfully lived on those. They were designed for it. And many barges, similarly, particularly on the continent, have accommodation for the families that traveled around on them. Then there are large cruising boats, things like ex-passenger boats and gentlemen's yachts, things that were designed for people to live on, perhaps not all the year round, but most of the year. And they have lots of accommodation, which is often designed, obviously, as a boat accommodation thing. People are used to the sort of accommodation that you have on cruise ships. It's very popular, of course, and that's the kind of accommodation you would expect to find on those boats. And then there are Thames houseboats, which are sort of designed to living aboard. I mean, not for large numbers of people, but 1 or 2 people to live on board. So those are designed as liveaboards, but there are most of the boats that people live on are actually converted working boats, both because it's a very convenient space to have a cargo space, which is once empty, completely designable. You can do pretty much what you want inside. The trick is to try and make it look okay from the outside, as far as I'm concerned. But on the other hand, people can do what they like. So the cargo space can be modified for living in. So that's things like barges, cargo ships, landing craft were quite common at one point. Of course, they were designed for people to stand in and for army munitions and so on. But they are converted to live on quite often. Naval ships as hulks. Now, naval ships are often built to last much longer than they did in commission. And when out of commission, they were often used as training ships, hospitals or prisons. There's a tradition of those. The hospitals, for instance, near Greenwich, they had 2 or 3 large naval ships that the sailors actually, rather than going to the hospital in Greenwich, which was designed for them, rather preferred to stay on the boats. And of course, prisons on boats are meant to make it quite difficult to escape. And Dickens and others, of course, have used prison hulks as, and in Les Miserables, you probably remember that part of the story is on a prison hulk. And that's one of the reasons why some of these boats have survived. They would otherwise have been scrapped, but they're used for all these other purposes and therefore don't get scrapped. They're found useful. So navally commissioned ships, I've mentioned cadet training ships. I'll go through some examples of these. Hospital hulks at Greenwich, prison hulks like in Great Expectations. Storage hulk, the SS Great Britain, which of course has been successfully resuscitated, brought back from the Falklands, was in fact used as a storage container for many years, pretty much wrecked otherwise, but it surprisingly survived. Most of the hull and everything else has been restored. In fact, the only bit of internal stuff which apparently still exists is the captain's bath, which if you ever go there, you'll see it's a pretty battered looking thing, but it has a plug in the middle, which is a great design feature for boats, because of course you don't want to have anything that relies on the boat not being tilted. Okay, so rowing club boathouses, the Oxford College barges, restaurants. People have restaurants. We have one in Richmond until very recently on a college barge opposite us. The recording studios seem to be quite a common way of using the planning advantage of being able to be offshore in effect. You don't have the same planning constraints that you do if you're building on land. And several people have used this. Richard Branson had one in Little Venice. Pete Townsend had one in Twickenham. There's a boat called Astoria, which has survived really because it has this enormous thing inside. I'll show you pictures of that. And just for completeness, there's a brothel. We actually lived in Little Venice for a little while and watched as a brothel opposite us on a narrowboat was being raided. Interesting contents displayed on the towpath afterwards, and sort of whips and chains and exciting things like that. Anyway, so it's all sorts of ways you can use boats. And of course, what we're really talking about is residential. That is for people to use as their permanent accommodation. Just a few examples then. Prison hulks like the Discovery at Deptford on the left. You can see an old naval ship which basically survives long term with people on board being incarcerated. HMS Britannic, this is a hospital ship. Many ships were designed as possible hospital ships in an emergency. HMS Britannia, for instance, the Royal Yacht was meant to be used as a hospital ship if necessary. Cadet training ship, the Trincomalee was built, as you see, just after the Nelson period, 1817, in India, in Bombay. It survived long term, really because it's made of teak. It's the most fantastic. Unlike most British ships built of oak, it didn't rot it because the teak lasts long term. And when it was decommissioned, it became a training ship called Foudroyant, which many people remember in Portsmouth docks. So many sea cadets were trained on there. And when they finally decided to let it go, it was actually restored back to how it had been in the 19th century as a sailing ship. And it's still afloat, sits in a covered, a closed dock in Hartlepool. You can go and visit it. And it's pretty much exactly as it was with its original timbers. So it survived really in the long term because it was lived on, or used as a training ship. This is a Dutch barge, the Grand Cru, which hasn't been there for some time, but when it was used as a recording studio. Pete Townsend's one of his houses, sitting outside with some very elaborate and very smart recording equipment inside. A similar thing on Astoria. Astoria was Fred Carnot's army. He was a showman in the last century, and it has cabins which people lived in. I mean, Charlie Chaplin slept there, things like that. So it was a residential boat for a long time, and of course has now been reincarnated as this showman's studio. And that's one of the things that the thrust of this talk is really that heritage boats can be preserved as houseboats and then restored. That, you know, this is a possible use to stop them being scrapped. And I'm going to talk a bit about the boats I've lived on. I've lived on a number of different old boats. And just to show you a few examples of the sort of thing. So this is a boat I lived on as a medical student a long time ago in the 1970s. My wife and I lived in Oxford on the canal next to the teaching hospital, the Radcliffe Infirmary. And this was a boat which had been a working boat. There's a picture of it in the encyclopedia in the 1930s. It was built in about 1935. And having been converted, not by me, but it was converted some years later, and it was deconverted and has now become a traditional small woolwich carrying boat. It was the Grand Union Canal Carrying Company. You see at the bottom how it is now, with pretty much its original livery and as it was when it was first built. It doesn't carry cargo much, but you know, that would really be a complete restoration, of course. This is a slightly different thing. It's a steam inspection launch. Sabrina was built a long time ago, evidently, on the Gloucester as an inspection launch for the Gloucester and Berkeley Ship Canal. So it was sort of company rolls that they took up and down the canal every year to give the directors a bit of an outing and show them that the place wasn't falling to bits. And it eventually found its way to Rickmansworth, around the south coast, amazingly, and had got this sort of chicken coop you can see in the lower left-hand corner, built on the top. And it was lived on a farm on a freshwater river for many years. And we found it, brought it and converted it back to steam. And you can see a picture of what it's like now. It's steaming some years after we took it over, and it wouldn't have really survived at all if it hadn't been lived on for many years, and that's really survived. Underneath that rather unprepossessing exterior you can see there was the original teak and mahogany, and the whole thing was pretty much exactly as it had been, apart from the steam machinery which had been taken out, but that could be removed, put back, of course. So that's another boat that survived. This old wreck is the one that we lived on, or we still do. It was built in 1916 by a Swedish boatyard for a Danish banker as a luxury yacht, middle of the First World War. Extraordinary time to be building boats like this, but they did. And it was built fairly lavishly with all possible mod cons, and picture of it being launched. And it was sold to, the chap went bankrupt. It was sold to somebody in England, then he sold it to someone in France, and then it was in France for a long time, and then came back to the UK. It stayed on the Thames for many, many years. It was lived on in Kingston, near where we live now. And when the chap who lived on it retired, he handed it over to a sea cadet training ship organization. So that the sea cadets took it over and called it Training Ship Windsor Castle. So it was at Windsor for many years as a cadet training ship. And then it basically deteriorated. Everything inside was still resuscitable. I mean, the engines were still running, probably the oldest marine diesels in the world now. And it eventually came downriver and ended up just near us. And you can see it derelict on the gasworks mooring at Brentford. The gasworks are still there at the time. The church is still there. The gasworks has been demolished. But it was sinking and had large holes in the side, and it was rusty as anything. And that old rust bucket we happened to find at the time that we needed a mooring to change from our narrowboat to something a little bit bigger, because our boat mooring was 100 feet long and the narrowboat 72 feet long. This is 30 meters, 100 feet long. So it more or less fitted the mooring. So in spite of all the other defects, it was more or less the right size. And it was a lovely boat underneath, I thought. My wife isn't always that optimistic about boats like this, but we were told by a surveyor that he could get it to go to sea again. It had been condemned as unfit to go to Dunkirk in 1940. So you can imagine it had been out of commission for a very long time, was never going to go to sea again unless there was something pretty drastic done. But luckily, there was a boatyard locally that managed to put the hull together again. And as you see, it was restored and it goes to sea regularly still. And that's a picture of it traveling. So, you know, if it hadn't been lived on, it would certainly have been scrapped. The value of the portholes alone, I mean, there's 22 portholes each side, beautiful bronze portholes. And what we paid for it was probably the value of the portholes. So, you know, it got to a point where it was possible to restore, but only just. And it was saved really because it had been lived on. And this is the sort of interior that you can imagine living on a boat can be fairly primitive, and it was in the early days, but it started to get a little bit better. And you can see in the 1920s when it was first built, the construction is pretty much the same as it is today. Full electric lighting throughout, central heating, you know, hot and cold running water, all that kind of thing. Fully electric lighting, and you know, it was quite well set up for the time, and the interiors pretty much as it was. The mahogany antique that they built it of was almost indestructible. It just needed to be repolished. And as you see, there are all sorts of aspects that the designer's drawing. You can see the paneling is all drawn out. We have a complete set of drawings from the designer, which include paneling, which rather like in an old house which has been restored, does tend to limit things. It's difficult to change stuff when you have all the drawings to show what it was originally. And it's one of the problems, as with listed buildings, that it's quite difficult to explain why you've changed stuff if the way they built it first was best. Just for interest, on the left below there, you can see there's a dumbwaiter. If you look at the saloon table where we're sitting, behind us, behind my head, is the top end of the dumbwaiter you can see there, which was designed to take food and stuff up and down from the galley, which is immediately below. And on boats, it's actually quite important. A lot of the companionways are fairly steep. You don't want to be carrying food up and down. So that was a nice design feature, which was restorable. And lots of other things about the boat have been restored. I'll go through a few others. We brought up a family on board. As you can see, this is fairly usual type of domestic stuff. But one slightly bizarre thing on the left, my son is standing upright, but the boat is about 30 degrees from the vertical. As you can see, his dressing gown is hanging down. He's standing in his cabin looking a little bit, he's looking cheerful enough, but actually the boat has toppled over to one side and the boat, the mooring where we were drained out unexpectedly, and can be quite exciting when that happens. But as I say, we survived that, but children survive anything. I think it's one of the great advantages of childhood is that endless flexibility. And of course, apart from just living on board, we took it to sea. And from about 1988, last been to sea in 1938. So we took it pretty much on a replica of its original voyage down to Queenborough and the Swale 50 years later. And it worked pretty well. The interior was designed to have a crew of 8 with the passenger. The owner's party was 6, and the crew, including no doubt a chef and a steward and half a dozen hefty Swedish matelots to lift and do all the sort of things that you expect crew to do, were accommodated in the forecastle mostly, but there was space for 16 people on board, and we have travelled with 16, some children, but and 1 or 2 in the ship's boats as stowaways. It's always a nice way of introducing children to living afloat. So this is the kind of thing when we're travelling. More pictures, I suppose, of the sort of thing you might expect. It was designed, obviously, as a yacht. Probably the owner, who had some racing yachts, some big racing yachts, used to take it as a support yacht to regattas, and we've been to that sort of event as well. But the nice thing about it is that it's very usable for that kind of thing, and it's pretty much as it always was. So many people live on boats and never move them, but we do try and move ours. Here are pictures of on the left is a picture of going in a parade of ships in Brest, going from Brest to Douarnenez. And one can relax on the back deck as well, having hammocks. It's quite comfortable when you're traveling, when it's not too rough. But a lot of the time we're on mooring, and this is the sort of thing that we have to put up with. Clearly the boat has to be looked after during the winter, and living on a boat means you generally try and keep it warm and dry throughout the year. One of the problems with boats which are left on marinas or else places where you can't look after them very well and you're not staying on board is that they can deteriorate quite quickly. They can sink when you're not there. All sorts of terrible things can happen. So living on board does actually mean that they get to survive well, but you have to find a mooring for the boat that suits it and that suits you. And as you can see, there are several, I'll talk a bit about moorings now because this is such an important part of residential boats existence that it needs to be emphasized. There are a number of traditional old moorings on the Thames and elsewhere. On the canals, Little Venice and Paddington, boats have been lived on for many years there. Doylicart Island's mentioned. It's an island near Shepperton on the Thames. Historically, it was where the Residential Boat Owners Association started about 50, 60 years ago, when the owner of the island wanted to chuck all the boats off. They were living in a community around the island, and they got together and set up an association which still exists. And many other islands on the Thames have boats surrounding them, many of which don't travel, but some of them do. And that's on the non-tidal Thames. But further down at Duxford, we're half tidal, Thistleworth, Chiswick is tidal. Going downriver towards Chelsea, there's a very famous old mooring at Cheyne Walk. Location. A wonderful place. To live on Cheyne Walk was considered the height of chic at one point, and living on a boat was considered an option to get the address. And lots of people lived on very beautiful old boats there, and still do. Further down is a new mooring called Hermitage Community Moorings, which was set up really to try and encourage heritage boats that couldn't find moorings otherwise to live as a community and be part of the local community, I suppose. And let's just run through a few of these moorings and what they were like. This is some old photographs, of course. Hampton Court, as you see, several old boats moored up on the river there, and the kind of thing that you'd see at Henley during the regatta. People used to tow large numbers of boats like this up to live on during the regatta through Henley Week. There were competitions which were reported in a newspaper called the Lock to Lock Times, which had its heyday in about 1895 to about 1900. And they had competitions for who had the best decorated boat and all that kind of stuff. But it was a culturally quite well-recognized thing to do. This is a bit more modern, of course, but the boats you see on the top left, Tags and Ash, these are boats of a similar sort of thing, but they have a second story, which means they aren't going to move anywhere. They can't get through the bridges, so they've been slightly overdeveloped, I'm afraid. All the houseboats that you saw in the previous pictures, of course, were designed to be towed usually from Oxford down to Henley, so they had to get through the bridges, it's quite hard work, they're quite low, so they were small and beautifully designed to do that. But of course, nowadays people want a bit better view, they build on top. Similar thing at Swan Island. Duck's Walk, where we live, used to be known as Dutch Walk because it was full of Dutch barges. There's about one left, I think, now. Well, no, 2 or 3 left, but they were all mobile boats. Very few move now, except us. Further down, Thistleworth, just below the Lockney where we are, is a community that has a lot of nice old boats in. It's a company which everyone belongs to. They have some tenants, but most of the people that live there actually own a share in the mooring itself, which is a good model. Chiswick Pier was set up as a charity, in fact, a non-profit mooring. Not quite so much now, but it was originally set up to try and keep some old boats going that needed a mooring that they could use. And as you see, lots of old boats there which still use that mooring. And Cheyne Walk, which we mentioned earlier down at Chelsea, a lot of very fine old boats there, but people have written about it. There's a famous book by someone called Penny Fitzgerald, won the Booker Prize many years ago, about living on an old barge at Cheyne Walk. It's very depressing actually, because it keeps sinking. But you know, it's literature, and culturally, it's a very interesting place to live. Hermitage, I mentioned earlier. This is further downriver. Hermitage community moorings are a new mooring which was set up specifically to preserve old boats. As you see, there are lots of them there. Very few of them actually British, but mostly Dutch and elsewhere. But they are all heritage boats, and it's one of the conditions of living there is that you have an old and interesting boat. It's an interesting problem that they had when they first arrived. Culturally, they had to persuade the councils on both sides of the river where they were that this would be a good thing. And clearly, the new developments on each side, lots of people living in flats, they don't always want to have boats in front of them. This is a problem throughout redevelopment of docks. People feel that boats get in the way. And those of us who live on boats, of course, feel that's the wrong attitude. We rather feel that a lot of the houses have been built to rather spoil the view as well. But there we are. So Tower Hamlets and Wapping finally got persuaded after a long and very useful battle to try and show that these had a community use and that are still used by the community as a good way of keeping good relations with the people that live around them. And of course, there are docks further down. The docks are mostly underused. St. Catherine's Dock has been used for living in for many years. It's now actually legal. Many of the boats were illegal for a long time, but now both in South Dock and St. Catherine's Dock, there are people living happily in the centre of London on moorings which are sometimes quite expensive, but are very convenient for people who want to live in the city. And when you travel around the world, you will see that this is quite a common pattern. In fact, it's commoner than most people think. I mean, if you get a picture of Copenhagen, it's often this, which is Nyhavn, which is a heritage harbour, in effect, for old boats. And it's such a tourist trap that they use it in their tourist literature. And the same thing, of course, we could do in London if we if we took it seriously. It would be possible to do that. They do it here. They do it in Stockholm. Stockholm has a number of very fine, quite large old boats, and many others that are still mobile, but these aren't mobile, used as accommodation. Drottningen's a hotel used to be a luxury yacht, belonged to Lady Hutton, the Woolworths heiress. Still has its engines. I don't think they'll ever go again, but it's a very fine old boat. I've stayed on it. And Aft Chapman is a hostel. It's even older, but it's a sailing ship that was built in the UK, as indeed was, I think, Vanadis. Many of these boats are in fact British, but have ended up in places around the world, as so much of the British Navy was. And that the Aft Chapman is, say, a traditional old boat. It keeps most of its accommodation exactly as it was, and the galley and so on. But as a sailing ship, of course, doesn't have an engine room much. But it can be used for living afloat all the year round and is used successfully for that. In Amsterdam, the Dutch, of course, have a long history of living on boats. Their councils actually encourage it, and they get grants from the government to set up residential moorings for boats. This is highly sought after in many parts of Holland. And there are two categories of museum ships. In fact, the boats themselves can be given grants to restore them back to as they were originally. And they can sometimes be to museum standards and can't move. Others are encouraged to move and are quite high standard. But there is a long tradition of people living on these museum ships as part of museums. This is actually the Maritime Museum in Amsterdam with a restored sailing ship, a replica sailing ship outside. But the Dutch, of course, have shown us the way, as in so many things. And here's Paris. Well, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These moorings are part of a UNESCO site, and designating it as a cultural heritage site is actually quite something. The boats are mostly fairly undistinguished. They were very fine. Most of the boats that originally set up the colony in Paris were actually British, but the French then discovered that this was a good idea, so they kicked all the Brits off and took over themselves. But they are quite an interesting set, which have managed to persuade the Parisians that they're a good thing, and the Parisians have prevented mayors of Paris chucking these boats off over many years, and mainly because they like walking down the side of the river and seeing all these boats with their flowers and trees and things on top of them. And culturally, it's a fine site and maintained as the local community want it. Now, I've talked about moorings and boats. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's an important aspect of this, which is that boats that go downhill as a result of inevitable aging, like all of us, I guess, one can often restore them to almost as new condition if they're saved in time. And there are a lot of boats where this has happened. I'm just going to show a few here. This was partly originally a talk to museum curators, because museums often have boats of this sort that they don't know what to do with. And what we're suggesting is that they should look after them in such a way that it can be restored in the longer run. Let's just run through a few then. This is in alphabetical order, in no particular order. This is a big yacht, obviously. Was lived on by an old naval gentleman and his wife for many, many years on the Orwell, and was restored, as you can see, to sailing condition after 30 or 40 years of apparent dereliction. The Amazon is another good example. It was lived on by Captain Mannering, if you remember your television series. He and his family lived on this boat in London, and it was restored after they left it to be restored like a modern, well, like a steam yacht. It isn't actually steam, but it is, as you see, in pretty good condition now. Here's a boat that was the National Historic Ships sail, the boat of the year a couple of years ago. It's a houseboat. In fact, it's still a houseboat, but has been restored to sailing condition. As you see, it has these amazing sails, which Humber keels used to have. So really, to keep it in that condition and look after it required a use which turned out to be a residential use. This Norfolk Pleasure Wherry, a sailing ship, it's come back to being used obviously for pleasure now, but it was lived on as a houseboat for many years without moving, and of course it's now gone back to full wherry sailing condition. This is a boat which isn't on the historic ships thing because it's not in the UK. It's been in the Mediterranean for some years. It was actually a neighbour when we were in Brentford on the gasworks. It was next door to us being restored. It was a wreck, and as you see, it's no longer a wreck, but that was being lived on for a number of years by neighbours of ours. A Dunkirk little ship. There are many Dunkirk little ships, of course, some of which are lived on. This is an example. Been lived on for many, many years, and still goes to sea, of course, goes to Dunkirk. This is a boat which has been a bit, well, it's not fully restored as the Flying Boat Refueler, but it was lived on for a number of years till the owners got kicked off their moorings in Teddington. But it's now moored in Church Island. It's one of the rare survivors of a Flying Boat Refueler, which wouldn't have survived almost certainly had it not been lived on. Another way of using the residential status, as it were, is to actually sell the accommodation. This is a light ship, which of course couldn't have been accommodation when it was a light ship out at sea, but now that it's moored up, has quite a lot of accommodation. The crew that lived on the light ships, of course, had to be accommodated, and they were there for many years, well, months at a time, so they had to have reasonable accommodation. But you can see it can be quite a comfortable place to live, and that's 100 and, well, whatever it is, 180 years old. Sailing barges like the one we started with, the Ark Royal, so-called, the sailing barge that Allardyce lived on, often looking a little bit derelict, like this example here. But the Mirosa, as you see, has been restored to sailing, and many old ships like this survive as wooden hulks, which look as though they're completely impossible to restore, but because wooden ships are expensive to restore, but because sailing barges are so rare and so special nowadays, people are prepared to put quite a lot of money and grants and so on into restoring them to sail. But had they not been houseboats, they would almost certainly have been burnt or cut up with chainsaws. Here's an example of a very old boat, which still travels, still crosses the North Sea apparently, but has been a houseboat for a very large number of years, which has allowed it to survive. And to go back to our boat, Sabrina, this is just to show that having been a houseboat for 50 years, it it's now turned back into what it was always designed to be, as a sort of inspection launch at this, for the River Thames. So these are the examples that I've given of my own and other boats that have been lived on and survived as a result. And of course, this is part of this is to inform people about what the problems are, what the advantages are, but also what the long-term outlook is going to be. And one suggestion is that we need a campaign to try and keep these boats going. That National Historic Ships, the sort of national organization which registers these boats, should certify that they're historic to give them advantages if necessary as a cachet that would have monetary value, possibly as reducing fees and so on. The Environment Agency, the Port of London Authority are people who organize moorings, of course. They could easily reduce fees in many heritage harbors on the continent. Fees are waived completely for old boats that stay in these places because they're seen as a tourist attraction. This is not something that as yet we haven't yet persuaded these organizations. Canal and River Trust would be another organization that navigation authorities could perhaps reduce their fees or abolish fees for boats of interest. Heritage Lottery Fund, of course, funds all sorts of heritage things, including boats, but they're a little bit fussy about how they should be looked after and how they should be maintained. And one suggestion is that if permanent crew could be allowed, then if they fund a vessel, it doesn't have to be exactly as it was originally, because permanent crew will actually keep them in better state than they would otherwise. Local councils can encourage old boats by giving them planning permission for moorings and controlling their appearance and by regulations and bylaws. These appearance and regulations and bylaws are actually quite complicated. It's difficult to define exactly what a traditional or historic or heritage boat is. But if you want to attract them, then one of the ways of doing so is to have bylaws that define what you want, and this can be done. Maritime Heritage Trust is an organization, it's an umbrella organization for a number of old boat organizations, the Old Gaffers and Steamboat Association and so on. And they have a campaign at the moment for setting up heritage harbors, a similar program that's been going on in Europe for many years, in Germany and Sweden and elsewhere, Germany and Holland particularly, but they have government funding for their harbors. We haven't yet arranged that in the UK, but this idea that harbors with traditional facilities should be preserved for traditional boats, and that for the general public and for the boats themselves, we shouldn't let them all go. We should look after them and make sure that they survive both as a place that boats can stay, but also as a source of maintenance and other workshops which provide employment and so on, which tend to disappear if harbors are redeveloped. So where can you find out more about this? Well, I mentioned earlier this classic tome by Cyril Ionides about his barge that he restored. A.V. Herbert wrote a famous thing about the water gypsies. It's called The Water Gypsies, and it was about people living on boats, a novel about families. It gives a nice idea of sort of between the wars residential use of narrowboats. Tom Rolt's book, of course, The Narrowboat, and it was called Cressy, and he wrote a supplement about traveling on Cressy. But that's all about him and his wife living on this boat, which they converted. Ginny Brown was a debutante who lived in Chiswick on a boat which kept sinking, which used to rather worry the Fortnum's delivery chaps when they'd turn up and find there wasn't anything to deliver to. But she was very insistent that she should have proper deliveries by serious stores, like I say, Harrods and Fortnum's. And she writes about this and about the sort of problems that a Deb in the 1960s would have had, I suppose, but is very keen on this idea of swans coming to the window, which of course many people tend to go on about with boats living on the river. This this novel by Penny Fitzgerald, Offshore, is won the Booker Prize in the 70s. It's all about the community in Chelsea, and has all sorts of things that people who live on boats recognize, like always the discussions between other boats when they're having a campaign to try and keep the boats going. They meet, everyone's known by their boat name, not by their surname. This is quite normal in boat circles, because quite often, boats change hands, but the boat themselves says itself. So your representation is for your boat, not for yourself. That kind of thing. Culturally, it's a very interesting community. People who live on boats will tell you that there are a lot of individuals, but the culture and the community as a whole has all sorts of fascinations. And having been involved with organizations of residential boaters, I can tell you that it's like herding cats. They're a very, very indisciplined and anarchic group, but a group nevertheless which share the same problems that lots of people living on boats will tend to have with a community which as a result of all this antagonism, they get together to fight it. And that's something that tends to produce a community more than other things. It's like a village with a very long main street. They say the canals are like that. It's a village with 1,000-mile main street. Okay, so practical information, quite apart from all this cultural stuff. There's a book called The Barge Buyer's Handbook, produced by the Barge Association, and the Residential Boat Association have a thing called Living Afloat. Much of what they have in it is actually dissuading people who don't know about living on boats by giving all the nitty-gritty, the things that actually make it difficult to live afloat. One shouldn't go into this with eyes without thinking carefully about the problems. And I've touched on some of them, but clearly there are compensations. And on a nice day, it's a fantastic place to live. Middle of winter, when there are gas leaks and the lavatory needs sorting out and all sorts of ghastly things are happening. It can be a little bit bleak, but there are compensations, and most people who live on boats, if they live for any long time, they get used to it and like it. So that's my take on living on boats. And as I say, old boats particularly, but people live on all sorts of things these days. But I would like to point out that this is something that it's a cultural thing which many people rather like. They like to see old boats on the river, and this is one way of keeping them there. And I hope that this will continue and will keep this cultural and tangible and intangible heritage going for many years to come. And I think I'll hand back to the chairman now. Henry, if there's anything else you want to say. Obviously, had this been a live meeting, we would have had questions at this point, but very happy to try and help through, say, social media systems that Maritime Heritage Trust has. We can try and help people who want to know more about this. And I hope those of you who listened will find it interesting and worthwhile, and maybe one day live on a boat yourself.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. That's really wonderful. You've given us a tremendous taste of all the great variety of craft, which would not have survived without being someone's home for a period in their lives. And what a great heritage it is. We at Maritime Heritage Trust are very keen to support maritime heritage in any form, including people living aboard vessels like this. And if you do have any points that you'd like us to follow up, please do contact us at maritimeheritage.org.uk. And you'll find us either on a website or Facebook, Maritime Heritage, and we'll be delighted if you would get in touch. Thank you again.